Oh, thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I can see the energy building up from the first speaker to the second speaker, who is obviously very eloquent in driving passion. You can see the passion with which he pushes his agenda. Now, for me, I take a bit more academic, kind of like Kemi said in his beginning, more systematic approach, which has to be very structured. The first thing I did here in this presentation is sort of first look at the data, like she said, on, and that's a very good place to start. What is the data on unemployment in Africa, and what is the real crisis that we face? Now, obviously, from this research I've done, which would I could feel Kevin's figures were quite the same. 43% of people are basically under the age of 15, 41% of people are basically in poverty. These are all IMF and World Bank data, OECD data. One very critical point is 10 million people enter the job market every year. This is in Africa. This data is all about Africa, really. 10 million people entering the job market every year. Typically, more than 40, 60% are graduates now in today's world. The quality of the graduates is a different story. We'll talk about that. Africa, for example, is growing at about 2.5% population growth every year. And we look at that at 1.3 billion people. You're talking about 3.25 million new people being born. Now, that's very interesting because the growth of Africa is basically an opportunity, but it will also become a cost. Let's go more with the data. The opportunities are available to Africa, and that's where we actually have to look at where we really have to focus. The stock market is basically broken down. If you look at every stock market in the world, whether it's Johannesburg Stock Exchange, whether it's the DAX index in France, or whether it's the CAC index in France, the DAX index in Germany, the London Stock Exchange, they are broken down into these sectors until we begin to align ourselves to areas of comparative and competitive advantage. Africa is in big trouble. Now, let's look at the energy sector. Energy sector alone contributes about, in terms of revenues alone in a year, the market is actually worth about almost almost a trillion, as at 2017 from research. And by 2025, this energy sector is going to be about 1.2. Now, the question is why African universities are not yet doing this. We have universities, plateaus all over the whole Africa. None of them is positioning fully in harnessing the opportunities that this industry provides, even though with the natural solar energy that we have, and you can see renewable energy is going to be very big in the future. We have the basic material industry, which contains these elements, acquisition, development, and processing of mining and the rest. We find out that most of the mines we have in Africa are actually mined by foreign companies. Very interesting that you have all your wealth under your feet, but you don't even know how to mine it. 50 years later, after independence, 60 years, 6 decades after independence of most African countries, we are still lacking in the ability to actually mine these things ourselves. We have the industrial goods sector, which you see examples all here, selling machineries, equipment. I don't think Africa is very strong on that yet. We're looking at consumer discretionary goods, the kind of goods that we consume. And like Kemi rightly said, consumption becomes the focus of how we can turn things around. Let me keep going. Consumer staple goods are the ones that you can't do without. This is where agriculture fits in. And I was very particular about agriculture being arable land and aqua. A good example will be Nigeria, which imports over $750 million. Sorry, am I saying $million? $750 million of fish, frozen fish in a year. Importing like $1.6 billion worth of, just Nigeria alone, of sugar, raw sugar. Importing $4 billion of textiles. Importing $1.6 billion of cereal made from maize, made from other ingredients that we can make locally. So we come here saying we are poor. I wonder how poor we can be, really. We go into healthcare issues. We're not very competitive. Why I highlighted these two particularly are the two areas where Africa seems to focus on. Africans seem to focus more on building the service industry in terms of serving the system, but that is something that you can do without. And with new technology now, we are going to be in big trouble. All these professions are at risk, except for IT and possibly logistics. We are looking at that sector, real estate. Real estate is another new one, but unfortunately, most of the real estate materials are actually imported. I just wanted to give an idea of how to think. If you want to build an industry, if you want to talk about the educational system, you have to design your educational system to plug into these sectors, the ones you think you have the strongest advantage, and then make yourself the world leader in that. If I proceed on that and go to a bit more data in terms of, because I want to be more data driven, and I think this session might be not enough for that. 1 second, sorry. So let me just go to 64%, sorry. I want to get the graphs in fully. If you get these graphs in, which I try to analyze, I drew up the data from the World Bank and from Strata. And this data, if you look at it carefully, this is the pattern of what Africa is looking at. In 1920, the change in GDP, the gross domestic product of Africa generally by country, indicates very clearly that the GDP in Africa is actually dropping. If you look at it carefully, this line, the blue line, is the change in GDP in 2019 and the change in GDP of unemployment. So I try to match unemployment and GDP. Unfortunately, you see very here, the blue line. The blue line shows that GDP is kind of, all of them are mostly negative. You see them below the line, this is zero. They're all almost negative. Negative figures GDP difference in terms of growth. But if you look at the unemployment figure, which is this one, you can see a significant higher figure. So you have your GDP, your revenue basically dropping, and you have your unemployment increasing. Very interesting. When you go down, that's just from the World Bank, because I took two different data sets, the World Bank data set, and I took Strata, and Strata is a bit more up to date. They seem to be having more up to date data than that. So I took two different dimensions. You see the same pattern here, that the GDP is quite lower across the board, and the unemployment, except for countries like Tanzania, for example, and you can remember there was Magufuli. It's not surprising. Magufuli was very instrumental in ensuring that happened. Stop the imports and try to create jobs locally. So you see, unemployment in Tanzania particularly was quite low in terms of role in that period of time. Mauritius, but when you look at Seychelles, not a very big country, but generally the unemployment rose significantly. You look at countries like South Africa. I don't know what Sarah could say about this, but generally South Africa here seems to have a lower GDP and a bit of more unemployment figures. We look at countries like Namibia and we go across to things like Nigeria. So generally the data is indicating a lot of unemployment and a lot less GDP. So that's a really good sign of trouble ahead. Look at the change in GDP and the change in GDP for the 2 years. So you're looking at the change in gross domestic product per year. In 2020, it was far less, lower. The blue lines at 2020, 2019 was higher. What is it telling us? It's telling us now that the gross domestic product for African countries on the whole is actually dwindling. So your GDP last year, the red one, was actually slightly higher than the ones we are getting in 2020. Some might say it's COVID, but we'll see how long that sustains. Now, obviously, this is a series of unemployment. Obviously, the blue lines is unemployment, the latest one, seems to be a little bit higher, obviously, because of the range of percentage here. You might not see the effect very well, but you see that the blue line tends to be slightly higher on all the times, just confirms the data. Let's move a bit more towards more relevant data that draws attention to concerns. If we look at Africa, analyzed into regions, which I already did here, and I presented them in this format. So if you look at Africa presented in regions in terms of unemployment, this just validates the data that we looked at just now by regions. So the nation looks at it and you see that here, the per capita income, the income per person on average in Africa, are all negative. The percentage change, they all are negative as of 2019-20. So people are basically getting less income per person. You look at the elements of what? Unemployment by region, World Bank data. Just I just showed you now, unemployment is all positive across all regions. Slowest in Southern African region, but generally highest around the East African region, unemployment. Except, for one country like Tanzania, and most of them actually having higher unemployment using World Bank data. But when you look at the opposite data, looking from Strata, the latest data, it looks like actually East Africa has a lower level of unemployment compared to the rest of Africa. I'm not surprised. When you look at the stories of Rwanda, you look at the stories of Uganda, you look at Kenya, you look at those Eastern Bloc, they seem to be the future that seems to be taking over South African region. I'm just using data here. So I played around with the data, and I saw that overall, the GDP is not looking very good. The unemployment is not looking very good. Then we have this serious problem, which is what I tried to talk about, China. I'm not against China, but I've noticed a pattern that as the unemployment is increasing, the share of the Chinese market in Africa actually is increasing. So the production that should be happening in Africa seems to be going actually to China. We seem to be, like Kemi correctly said, consumers. And China, by giving loans to Africa, has seemingly moved in nicely to give us loans. I'm not against China, I repeat that again, please. I'm just emphasizing data of unemployment. So I come to this data set here. In this data set, I try to look at just the tomato paste industry as a very good example. Here's the consumption data on tomatoes in Africa. The green lines here all indicate what? The biggest import of tomato paste in Africa, which is a market of the market of tomato paste is $454 million. Tomatoes that Africa does not even produce, and we say we are unemployed. The green lines here show very strongly that China is the biggest importer of tomatoes into Africa. And then we have Italy. You look at the consumers. West Africa seems to be the biggest consumer of tomatoes. Very arable land, very good land. Unfortunately, $456 million is lost just by importing tomatoes that could create quite a lot of jobs. What do I mean by that? China controls about 45% of their foreign income comes from tomatoes to Africa. The external income is just exporting tomatoes to Africa. 45% of their external income actually comes from Africa. Italy makes about 16% of their income, foreign income, from tomato paste being sold to Africa. Together, China and India control about 95%. My question is why the universities of college and agriculture and technology and all these universities are not investing in producing even just tomato as a good example. I don't want to look at all this data in detail, but here's the summary of it. The biggest importers of tomato, just tomato paste. Nigeria, Ghana, mostly West Africa, like I saw in the data. But going right again, is another set of data that's quite interesting. Here's the tomato industry data. The biggest people that use tomato in the world import tomato. America is the biggest ones, about 30% import, Germany. So you see that Europe generally imports tomato paste. This is the market. The size of the market, just looking at the top 100 companies that import tomatoes, so a few African countries are among them. But let's look at the market of the market. This is about 10 billion US dollars of tomato paste. So if you produce tomato, Africa contributes about 456 million to it, about 4.75%. So if Africa can produce this, the question is, how many jobs can you create with this tomato replacement? Replacing your imports. Let's look at the data. 365 days in a year. The minimum rate of $1.90 is the poverty rate, according to the World Bank, poverty rate. If you multiply these two together, it means that if you can pay someone 694 US dollars in a year, they would actually cross the poverty rate. That means you can take one person out of poverty. Follow the data. If you take this data of the number of imports we have in Africa right now, and you divide it by this amount, $494, you will be able to produce, on average, at the minimum poverty rate, you're taking out about 657,000 people out of poverty just by replacing tomatoes. Very strange. When you look at the world market and you say, what if you become so good at providing just tomato and tomato paste to the world? Quality. And that also talks about industrialization. Forget about agriculture. There's also industrialization that goes with it. You move to the next stage, agricultural revolution and then industrialization. If you look at the world market and you take just 20% of the world market and say, Africa is so good at tomato production, it becomes the best in the world in production of tomato cheap, and they pay the minimum wage that gives them out of poverty, and you convert that to 20% of the total global market, excluding African market, it means by 694, you can create 2.6 million jobs. Put them together, what you're really saying is that you can create another 2.2 billion new income from just tomatoes and create about 3.3 million jobs, which increase about 0.47% to the employment rate. Now, that's basically putting out some countries which are actually causing you the poverty that you have. Now, I'm looking for one set of data, very important one. Let me just finish up here before I go into the other issues. Now, if we go down here, you will see the countries. These are the countries that have the highest rate of unemployment. I looked at the youth unemployment rates, and I looked at the imports from China. I tried to compare the two of them. We look at countries that have the highest number of Chinese imports. And I kept saying, I'm not against China, but I'm simply saying, if you look at what China is representing in the market of Africa right now, I'll just give you a data set here. Sorry, I think that's at the top here. 1 second, so I have all the sheets up here. So there's a data set that's up here. I need to find it quickly to save time. If you look at this data set, this is tomato paste. There's one set of data I'm missing, sorry. Let me quickly narrow my screen. There's one set of data I need to show. It's not coming up. Here, sorry, this data set, this one. This one here. So this data set is the unemployment rate right now in Africa. And like Kemi correctly said, generally, you should work from her data. I work from the data and looked at the 60% of people are between the age of 15 and 40. That's an average estimate of people. The highest unemployment right now in the world is Nigeria. The rate of unemployment. South Africa is the second largest one. Angola, Lesotho. So these are the number 1 in the world, number 3 in the world, number 4 in the world, number 8 in the world. Put them all together and you get a total data of close to about 14.54%, which is very similar to what Penny was talking about. That's about 111 million people. On average, that's the rate they tell you of the unemployment rate. But the problem I found was 2.1% increase in unemployment between these 2 years, 2019 and 20, is almost exactly equal to the figure of the population growth. What does that tell us? It tells us almost immediately that all the people that are being born are automatically unemployed. That's almost a stark reality. They increase the unemployment rate, and then you tie that up to the question of the youth unemployment, which is a bigger problem. The number 1 youth unemployment in the world, South Africa, 63.3%. Number 2 in the world, Angola, 56% youth unemployment. Number 3 in the world, Nigeria. Number 4 in the world was Kosovo. Number 5 is Namibia. When we look at all these top countries in the world and we look at them carefully, the top 8 countries, and we now looked at all the ones that had Chinese interests. China is number one here in terms of imports. China is number one, 2019, 2020. China is number one, 2019, 2020. China is number one, 2019, 2020. China is number 4 and 3 here, and they actually reduced their imports. But that population is not very big. The population of that country is just not very huge. When you look at all the huge populations in Africa, the ones in red, and you put them into data, it tells you that the highest rate of youth unemployment in Africa, 99.31% of the highest top 8 countries, removing these 2 that had a reduction, that had the lower population, 99% of them actually are the countries with China being number 1 import. What does that tell you? It tells you a very clear story, which is the last part I'm coming to. It tells you very clearly that the number of imports from China is the problem for Africa. This is China number 3, number 2, became number 3, became number 2 now, number 3, number 3. And then there's a very interesting country called Djibouti. Djibouti is here. Djibouti is a very interesting one, and I have to do that data separately. Djibouti has an increase of China's import of 32.8%, and China's import has now jumped to 43.3% in Djibouti, about 32% increase. Let's look at Djibouti as a very small country in the Horn of Africa and try to understand what the problem really is and how our educational system has to be designed to ensure that our people, like Kenny said, are entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurship should be taught in the system. Now, there's a very funny story. Here's the country's imports, 5.1 billion imports. The export was only 134 million, selling sheep and goat skin, That's 38 times the multiples. If you multiply this, divide them, 5.1 billion import, and only 134 million export. What does that tell me? 38%, 38 times. That's 3,800%. And this comes to the story of ACFA. This ACFA simply means that it seems like the Chinese are using this country to bring in the products into Africa and to distribute it. That raises a question about the loans on building tracks and trains and all this stuff. I don't know if those trains and track lines will serve the Africans, or actually serve to actually expand Chinese business in Africa. To summarize what I'm saying, really, what I'm simply saying is that, first of all, in terms of brain drain, our African graduates are not really bad. The only problem with African graduates is they work better when they're overseas. The African graduate will work 4 times, 5 times more difficult work overseas than when they're actually in Africa. We have to address that point as to why that is happening. Secondly, there's really no brain drain. I don't think there's a brain drain, really. I think to a large extent, it's a learning curve. Africans have to go overseas and see how things are done in one generation and maybe come back. This has happened in Israel when they were in Egypt. It's happened in China. China has sent a lot of people overseas to learn and came back. Not South Korea. Dubai is doing that right now. A lot of that is happening in Dubai. Saudi Arabia, Libya under Gaddafi used to send people overseas to learn and come back. India has done that. Britain and Europe generally in the mid-17th century and the 19th century, they went overseas to learn agriculture and bring in, this is where the slave trade came in anyway, the agricultural revolution. The problem really in African education and training is basically when leadership fails, the citizens then need to do what? They need to lead themselves. And this is where you talk about brain drain. People start to lead themselves when there's no leadership, and you can't blame them. If they get more money in dollars, pounds, dirhams, United Emirates, dirhams, and dollars and yens, they will go overseas. And that's why the educational system is supposed to be designed, as it's done in the West, to ensure that you don't just teach knowledge. You actually teach people to be intelligent. Intelligent means the ability to apply the knowledge. So that's what we are finding right now. So this is where I'm going to end up my own point and really raise the question that the educational system has to train people not just to be knowledgeable, but actually to be intelligent. So therefore, the guy who is building tomato should see the benefit of talking to the guy who builds industrial machines. The engineers should see the possibility of converting tomatoes into tomato paste and sell it to the world. This is that ecosystem that's lacking. It comes to leadership. It comes like my colleague also said earlier that you have to have personal drive to want to see a different perspective. Your learning should not be based on only what they teach you, but you actually go out and explore. You might find out that you're a pharmacist and you become the best person who does farming, because through your knowledge of pharmacy and medicine and maybe herbal medicine, you actually become the best agriculturist. And Africa needs to have billionaires who are actually agriculturists, not bankers, because the bankers are the ones sponsoring the imports and killing the local jobs. That's where I'll end my point for now. I think I've taken a bit too much time. Sorry about that.
That is absolutely classic. That is classic. And when data talks, there's no argument. And sometimes when I see these kinds of things, I ask a number of questions. The first question is, what did our ancestors do? For those, that was a joke. But the second question is this data visible to leadership? And is it an issue of They used to say in Nigeria back then with respect to power that some cabal is more interested in importing generators than in fixing power. I mean, is it that the data is available but ignored for private purposes? I mean, that's
Yes,
another question.
that's
Wow.
correct.
Then the third question is something Ladi said during when he was speaking about countries with strategic intent of going to learn and returning. I think our part of our problem is the returning part that is not so evident. Am I correct, Ladi? The returning part, it, we need to look at it more, or the strategic intent of the leaving, because as you're saying, people are leaving because they are leading themselves to better life for themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's leading themselves. So there's no real long-term plan to say, okay, what we really want to do is to, and I think that's one of the intents of this session. If we can lead ourselves to make better lives for ourselves, is there anything we can do that while we are making our lives better for ourselves, we look for a way to create something sustainable in our environment, because our future is at stake, as apparently our future is at stake. So let me open the floor a bit more and get a few responses in a few minutes from some of the other panelists. I don't know whether anyone has any feedback on these thoughts from Ladi, Yvonne, Kemi, Gathoni.